Right, hello everybody, welcome to the Adam Clery football channel. And does sacking your manager actually stop you getting relegated? You see it every single season, teams staring ominously at the trapdoor to the championship. The only thing the owners can think to do is to sack the man in charge and hope for the best. But does it actually make a difference? Well, as you're about to see, we have been deep through all the data of the last 10 years of the Premier League, and the results are quite interesting. Now, fair warning, this is the nerdiest thing we have ever made, so do you like decimal points?
No.
Alright, so back in November, the only thing that was closer to the sack than Daniel Farke was the male appendage. But he kept his job, and Leeds are now arguably the form team in the Premier League's relegation scrap. They've only had 2 defeats in the last 13, which is obviously really good. But last week, both Tottenham and Nottingham Forest could feel their arseholes twitching at West Ham's upturn in form and dispensed with Thomas Frank and Sean Dyche. Now, crucially, and it will become apparent as the video goes on, why this is crucial, right? At the time of me making this, neither of those teams are in the relegation zone, which is good, but between them, they have 1 win in their last 10 games, which is bad. Meanwhile, West Ham are currently in the relegation zone, but they've picked up 10 points out of the last 15, which means if you're Forest or Spurs, you are in deep shit, especially as you both got European fixtures to contend with. And their only option, it seems, was to replace the manager and hope for some sort of upturn in form over the remainder of the season. But the question we are here to answer today is, does that actually work? Is that a smart decision to make? And like I said, we've been through the last 10 seasons in the Premier League and looked at every single managerial sacking at the bottom of the table. Now, just full disclosure, right, this is an oversimplification and the video is going to be full of them, but we've looked at every single instance of a team between 15th and 20th in the league sacking their manager, and then what that eventually did for their final position in the league table, as well as how many games to actually work with the new manager had. And we'll stick a link in the description somewhere so you can have a play about with this yourself if you want, because if you're looking at it thinking, wow, Adam, I bet that took a long time getting all this data together and making it look relatively pretty, you'd be right. Yes, I didn't lose a day of my life doing this, so we couldn't all look at it more. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to make head nor tail of this zoomed all the way out unless you're watching it on the big telly. But the main thing to notice straight away, right, is the reds in this column here, because these are the finishing positions. If it's in red, those are all the teams who were eventually relegated. And the main headline straight away, right, is of the 49 examples there are of a team in the bottom 5 sacking their manager. That's all prior to this season where we've added another 5, right? Of those 49 examples, 24 of them ended up getting relegated. That is 48.9%, or half as a normal person would call it. So you'd look at that and you'd think, well, it's just basically a coin flip, isn't it? As many teams went down as didn't as a result of sacking their manager. So there's not really anything we can learn from that. But can you imagine if that was the entire video? Sorry, everyone, I did the math and there's no conclusions to be drawn. Can you imagine if that was it? No, sir, not here on ACFC. I didn't have no plans on Valentine's Day for nothing. First off, your starting position makes an absolutely massive difference. If we go and sort the graph by where teams were in the league when they made the sacking, of the 19 sides that were already outside of the relegation zone, only 3 of them ended up getting relegated. Leicester City last season, Alan Pardew's West Bromwich Albion, and Leeds United that season where they binned off Jesse March, then gave the job to Javi Garcia, decided that was bad, and then somehow expected Sam Allardyce to fix it with 4 games left. But then, on the other side of the coin, the 31 times a team already in the relegation zone sacked their manager, 20 of them still got relegated, and that is basically 2/3 of them. And so, straight away, you can see this idea that it's just 50-50 starts to shift. If you are already in trouble, if you're already in the relegation zone, the odds start to move away from being in your favour. You're more likely to go down than you are to stay up. So that then begs the question, what can make the difference for you? What do the 11 teams that clawed their way out of the relegation zone have that the 20 teams that stayed in it didn't? And you can see the answer to that really clearly on the graph, because if we look at the teams that did get out of the relegation zone after sacking their manager, the one thing they've all got in common is here, the amount of games they had remaining in the season. Every single one of those teams still had at least half of the season to play with. Sean Dyche took over from Frank Lampard at Everton with exactly half of the season played, but most of these teams have over 20, sometimes nearly 30 games with which to do something. And yes, obviously having time remaining does not guarantee you anything, but if you go and look at all the teams that couldn't get out of the relegation zone, look how frequently there are 19 games or less remaining. It's 10 for Rafa Benitez at Newcastle, Scott Parker at Fulham and Dean Smith at Leicester, only 16 for Paul Lambert at Stoke, and they were all teams, if you remember, who for a long part of that season felt too good to go down. And I mean, maybe they were, but they left it so late to make a managerial change, they couldn't fix it. In fact, if you are in the relegation zone at roughly the halfway point or later, only Sean Dyche at Everton, one time in the last 10 years, has changing your manager actually saved you. And you can see why time matters so much, because Dyche did make Everton harder to play against, but they still started with 6 defeats in his first 8 games. But after that, once he'd had time with them on the training ground, he got them to buy into what he was doing, it was only 4 defeats in the last 12. And obviously there was only 3 wins in that time as well, mind you, but that solidity it took him time to coach into the team ultimately got them some pretty massive away draws that ultimately kept them in division. And thinking back to Everton that season, if they'd left that a little bit later, do they then get that massive home win against Leeds? Do they grind out that draw away to Leicester? Probably not. But what if, right, you've crossed that threshold of the halfway point of the season and you're already out of the relegation zone? What does that do? Well, if you then elect to sack your manager, it's only been that Marsh Garcia Allardyce disaster at Leeds that then managed to slip into the relegation zone and get relegated. And what is particularly unusual about that example is that when they got rid of Garcia and brought Allardyce in with just 4 games left, they were already out of the relegation zone. They were 17th. But if you go back and you look at their fixtures, they were absolutely minging, and Allardyce only managed to get them 1 point from these last 4, when in reality, it turned out they needed 6. So I don't think you can blame Sam Allardyce for that one. The damage had clearly been done. And interestingly, right, Leeds sacked Jesse March around about the same time that Everton brought in Sean Dyche. And it's obvious that Javi Garcia was a disastrous appointment, but if they'd made it a little bit sooner or got Allardyce in originally, I can't remember if he was available or not, would that have saved them? Probably yes. So then, the question is, what does any of this actually tell us? Which parts of this can you repeat in the pub when you're with your friends who are normal? Well, first off, sacking your manager is not really a risk. Teams that are already out of the relegation zone almost never shoot themselves in the foot by making a change, no matter how long is left in the season. But, more importantly, I would say if you are already in the bottom 3, your chances of it saving your season are pretty good. I know we said 2/3 of them still go down, but making a change has saved 11 teams over the last 10 seasons, which averages out as it happens every single year. And just, if you purely want to play the maths on this one, right, the average change to a team in the bottom 5's position that sacking their manager has made over the last 10 seasons is plus 3.5. Now, obviously, there's some huge outliers at the very top here that are dragging that average up, but on average, statistically, you improve your league position. And again, gross oversimplification. Obviously, there are a million individual factors and every single team is different, but purely statistically speaking, it seems to work. But the most important thing you can see in these numbers is that if you are going to do this, if you are going to sack your manager, do it early. Your chances drastically scale up the more games you give someone coming in to actually change what's wrong. Now, the reasons for that are pretty straightforward, but the fact that if you do it before the halfway point, you're going to get a transfer window to play with as well as lots of time on the training grounds cannot hurt. However, if you would like to get even nerdier about this, and don't answer that wasn't a question, we're doing it anyway, I've already done the spreadsheet, okay? The real calculations start to come in when you look at what it actually is the incoming managers manage to change. In virtually every single team you look at here, the vital component is defensive solidity. And just to give you one quite drastic example here, right? The most recent brilliant comeback story we've had in the Premier League was Vítor Pereira's Wolves. They looked absolutely doomed at one point of the season, and then before you knew it, it was the pints and then the points. And the thing is, Gary O'Neill did have them scoring goals. 1.5 per game was much better than the other teams in the relegation zone, but 16 games into the season, they were still 19th. And across the 22 games Vítor Pereira had in charge, their goals per game actually dropped. It went from 1.5 to 1.3. But what's absolutely mad is the goals they were conceding per game went from 2.5 to just 1.3. Vítor Pereira had them scoring slightly less goals, yes, but he cut the number they were conceding almost in half. And as a result, their points per game trebled from 0.5. Look, I said there was going to be decimal points in this video. Do not look at me like that, right? To 1.5, and they leapt from 19th in the table to 15th. And if you go back to those examples of Dyche and Javi Garcia coming in almost exactly the same time in the season, Everton in the relegation zone and Leeds out of it, what reversed their fortunes was exactly the same thing. They had almost identical goals conceded per game at the point of the sackings, 1.6 and 1.7 respectively, but Dyche managed to shave that down to 1.4 per game while Leeds jumped to 2.5. Like, neither team had a noticeable change in the amount of goals they were scoring, but Dyche managing to just tighten them up ever so slightly at the back while Leeds spiraled and got worse is what made the difference and kept one up and sent the other down. And this, by the way, just to bring this entire video right back into the present, is precisely what should be worrying fans of Tottenham and Nottingham Forest. Because that is exactly what Nuno has managed to do at West Ham. They were conceding 1.8 goals per game at the point they dispensed with Ange Postecoglou, and Nuno has managed to get them down to just under 1.2. And this is why we said earlier on, time is so important, because despite those 2 wins he had at the start, he has had an absolutely grotesque run of form trying to get his ideas and his style of play into this team. And just like we saw with those other managers who've come in and eventually turned it around, this just awful initial set of results has finally started to bear some fruit in their most recent games. And like, what are we in now? February or something? There is still more than enough time for that defensive solidity to grind out the draws and the occasional wins they are going to need to overhaul one of those teams. Thomas Frank was averaging about 1.5 goals against, and Forest have been even higher than that across the 3 managers they've had this season. So with only a few points separating all 3 of these teams, it's West Ham who have the best defensive numbers. And as we've seen historically, it's that normally makes the difference. Oh, and just in case you're wondering, Rob Edwards has actually improved Wolves in this regard as well. He's taken them from 2 goals conceded per game, 2 to just 1.7. But at this stage, that is the same as like trying to plug the iceberg gash in the side of the Titanic by piling some towels up against it. Like, good job, you're doing your best, mate. We can all see that. But this thing, it is going down. So yes, there you go. That is how me and a Google Sheets sheet proves that if you are worried about getting relegated, you probably should sack your manager. It is a low risk, high reward strategy, and I've been on LinkedIn like twice. People love those. And just on the off chance you've stayed all the way till the end of the video, I do have a small favor to ask. Those of you who are following me on Instagram will know that my entire personality now is just going for runs. Look, I did this absolutely horrible one on Sunday, the wettest one they've ever done, but I'm doing the London landmarks for the Teenage Cancer Trust in like 6 weeks' time, and I need to raise some money for them. So I'm asking you, if you've got a spare £5, £10 or whatever, there will be a link to donate in the description. I'm trying to raise quite a lot of money for charity this year because I'm doing so much running, and I think that's the only way I can justify it without just saying it's a midlife crisis, which obviously it is. So anything you've got going spare, it's an absolutely unbelievable cause. I'm sure I don't need to tell you about the work they do. Like, being a teenager is horrible in general. Like, remember, it was really messy and you didn't know what was going on. So having to navigate all that and a disease like that at the same time, I cannot even begin to imagine the strength it must take, and they make a massive difference with people who are going through that. So if you have got any spare change, it is greatly appreciated. But yes, that's all the end of video drivel I'm going to give you. Subscribe to the channel, buy a t-shirt, become a member, all the fun stuff. Get me on social media at Adam Clery, CLEOI, yada, yada, yada. I actually weirdly enjoyed putting this together. So if you would like more weirdly deep analytical videos to have a look at, suggest some in the comments. I'll try and do a couple of more, and yeah, hopefully we'll all have a nice time. That's all I ever want. Goodbye.